All right, so today we're diving into something pretty interesting and maybe a little bit controversial. We're going to be looking at Medjugorje, the Marian apparitions. You've probably heard of it. It's a place with like a lot of devotion surrounding it. But we're going to explore a side of Medjugorje you might not be as familiar with. We're going to be going through Medjugorje: A Warning, a book by Michael Davies that presents a case against the apparitions.
Yeah, Davies was a very devout Catholic, and his book, it really, it takes a close look at all the evidence surrounding these apparitions. And he asks some pretty tough questions about, are they really authentic? Especially because, they've been going on for decades now.
Okay, so to really get into this, can you kind of set the stage for us? Like, what was happening in the church when these apparitions started? Davies seems to think that the timing is important.
Yeah, he does. He argues that the church, after Vatican II, after the Second Vatican Council, was going through, you could say, a crisis of authority. You had people questioning some of the traditional teachings and looking for answers, spiritual answers in new places that weren't always, in line with the church.
So it was almost like this spiritual hunger that was leading people to maybe look outside of the traditional structures of the church.
Exactly. And Davies thought that this made people more likely to believe in apparitions or to follow charismatic figures, even if those figures were, saying things that contradicted what the church taught. He uses the example of Palmar de Troya in Spain to really kind of drive home this point.
Palmar de Troya. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? I'm not familiar with that story.
Oh, it's a pretty wild story. Palmar de Troya, it was another place where people claimed to see apparitions. And at first, a lot of really devout Catholics were drawn to it. People were saying there were miracles happening, and people were attracted to just this intense piety, this outward show of piety. But it eventually led to a schism, a break from the church.
So even though it started with like what looked like genuine faith, it ended up dividing the church.
Exactly. And that's what worried Davies about Medjugorje. He saw some of the same patterns, and he was afraid that Medjugorje might lead people down that same path, away from the true faith.
That's a pretty serious concern. Okay, so if we're going to look at this critically, we have to talk about Bishop Pavao Zanic. He was the Bishop of Mostar, the diocese where Medjugorje is located, and he was very much against the apparitions.
Yeah, Bishop Zanic's opposition, it's really important. This wasn't just some random critic, He was the local bishop, the shepherd of that diocese. And think about it. He had every reason to embrace these apparitions, especially, when you consider what was going on in communist Yugoslavia at the time.
What do you mean?
Well, under a communist regime, imagine the kind of boost the church could get from something like this. You'd have pilgrims coming in, international attention, maybe even a rallying point for Catholics. These apparitions could have been a huge benefit for the church in a place that wasn't always very friendly.
So why would he risk all of that to oppose them?
Because he was convinced, based on what he saw, based on his investigation, that they weren't real. He even put together a commission to study everything that was going on, and most of the members concluded that this wasn't supernatural. It wasn't coming from God.
Wow. The local bishop, the one who knows the situation best, he comes out and says, these apparitions aren't real.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big deal, right?
It is. In the Catholic Church, the local bishop, he plays a big role in figuring out if something like this is authentic. His judgment carries a lot of weight. So for Bishop Zanic to come out so strongly against it, that's a big red flag.
And Davies clearly agrees. He actually spends a lot of time in his book looking at specific things, specific instances where he thinks the so-called seers, those young people claiming to see Mary, were actually deceiving people.
Right. One example he talks about is this incident with Vika, one of the seers. She said she was, immobile, like in ecstasy during one of these apparitions. And this French journalist, he wanted to test that, so he quickly moved his hand towards her eyes.
And what happened?
She flinched. And they caught it on film. Later, she tried to explain it away. But for Davies, this was a clear sign that the seers, they weren't being truthful about what they were experiencing.
Yeah, that does seem a little suspicious. But it's not just Vika, right? Davies mentions a priest, Father Ivica Vego, who was involved with the seers and who ended up getting in trouble with the church.
Yeah, Father Vego. He was expelled from his Franciscan order because of some very serious moral failings. And the interesting thing is the seers, they came to his defense. They claimed that Our Lady, that Mary herself, told them that Father Vego was innocent and that the bishop was wrong to punish him.
So they're saying the Virgin Mary is defending a priest who was disciplined by the church for doing something wrong, for being immoral.
That's what they claimed. And Davies, he finds this really troubling. It raises these big questions about what's really going on with these apparitions. Would Mary, the Mother of God, really go against the church's teachings on something so serious? It doesn't seem likely.
So we have this crisis of authority in the church,
Hmm.
a local bishop condemning the apparitions, and now potentially these seers contradicting church teachings. It's a lot to think about.
It is. And Davies, he doesn't stop there. He also gets into what he calls the Medjugorje industry, which is all about the money, the financial side of all this. And he finds that pretty disturbing.
Yeah, let's talk about that next. I'm curious what Davies uncovered about all the money flowing around Medjugorje. This is where things could get really interesting. Okay, so we were just getting into this idea of a Medjugorje industry. What exactly did Davies find out about, like, the financial side of all this?
Well, Medjugorje, it became a huge pilgrimage site, right? Like millions of people were going there. And that obviously led to, a whole economy springing up around it, hotels, restaurants, souvenir shops. And of course, you had all the books, videos, all kinds of devotional stuff being sold.
So there were a lot of people making money off these apparitions.
Yeah, exactly. And Davy starts to wonder if maybe, this financial gain, if it might be influencing the claims people were making. He talks about certain individuals, like this guy, Terry Calafrancesco, who was really involved in promoting Medjugorje and raising money for this big, extravagant Medjugorje tabernacle.
Yeah, wait, a Medjugorje tabernacle, what was that all about?
So Calafrancesco, his organization, Caritas, they were trying to collect millions of dollars to build this massive structure. And it was supposed to house, all these messages that supposedly came from Mary. Davies points out that the way they were going about raising money, it was kind of similar to what you see with some of those, televangelists. And he questions whether all this focus on money, is that really appropriate? Especially when you're dealing with something as sacred as Marian apparitions.
So Davies is basically saying that maybe money is clouding people's judgment. Maybe it's even leading them to exaggerate or make up stuff.
Yeah, that's one of his concerns. And he also points out how, if you try to question the apparitions, if you're skeptical, you're often silenced or pushed out of the movement. It creates this environment where it's hard to, have an open and honest discussion about the evidence.
It sounds like what you'd call an echo chamber. Only
Yeah.
the people who support the apparitions are welcome.
Yeah, that's kind of how Davies sees it. And to him, this silencing of dissent, that's a big red flag, a sign that something might be off. He also sees a connection between the whole Medjugorje movement and the charismatic renewal movement within the church.
Okay, what's the connection there? Maybe for our listeners who aren't super familiar with all the different Catholic movements, could you give us a quick overview of the charismatic renewal?
Sure. So the charismatic renewal, it's a movement within Catholicism that really focuses on experiencing the Holy Spirit, things like speaking in tongues, prophecy, healing. It became really popular in the 70s and 80s, and it's known for this emphasis on personal experience, on expressing your faith in, a more emotional way.
So it's less about studying theology and more about feeling the Spirit move you.
Yeah, I guess in a simple way you could say that. Now, Davies, he acknowledges that the charismatic renewal has brought a lot of good to the church, but he also sees some potential problems with it.
What kind of
Well, he says that when you put too much emphasis on personal experience, it can make people more vulnerable to being deceived, especially when it comes to apparitions or, private revelations. If you're just relying on feelings, it can be tough to figure out what's really from God and what might be coming from, your own head or even from something darker.
Yeah, that's a good point. We all want to experience God's presence, but we also need to be able to think critically about those experiences, right?
Right. Davies says our faith needs to be rooted in, the teachings of the church, in scripture and tradition, not just in how we feel. He sees the church's teaching authority, the magisterium, as really important for protecting us from, false prophets or fake apparitions.
Okay, so going back to Medjugorje specifically, one of the things Davies finds really strange is just how long these apparitions have supposedly been going on. Most Marian apparitions, Lourdes, Fatima, they last for a pretty short time, but Medjugorje had been going on for over 10 years when Davies wrote the book, and people were claiming thousands of messages.
Yeah, it is unusual how long it's been going on, and it raises questions, right? Why would Mary need to appear so often for so many years? What could she possibly have to say that would take thousands of messages?
I don't think Davies is buying she just likes to chat. explanation.
No, not at all. He argues that when you have this many messages, and a lot of them are, kind of repetitive and not really saying anything profound, it makes you doubt if they're really coming from God. And he says that some of them actually go against church teachings or encourage people to, like, follow the seers almost like a cult.
So it's not just that he doubts the apparitions themselves, but he also thinks the messages might actually be leading people away from the church.
That's his biggest worry. He sees a real danger in people putting these supposed messages from Medjugorje above what the church teaches. And he also points out these inconsistencies, contradictions in what the seers have said over the years. We talked about Vika flinching when she was supposed to be in ecstasy. But there are other examples, too.
Like what?
Well, at one point, the seers said that Mary had told them the exact date of this great sign that would prove the apparitions were real. And they even wrote down, like, the date and all the details of the sign, and they sealed it in an envelope to be opened later.
So they created their own prophecy with a date and everything. Did this great sign actually happen?
Nope, nothing happened. The date came and went, and no sign. And eventually they opened the envelope, and it turned out that one of the seers admitted to lying about the whole thing. He said he never actually wrote down any details about a sign.
Wow. That really makes you question their credibility, right? I mean, if they're willing to lie about that, what else are they making up?
Yeah, Davies thinks this is more proof that the seers aren't telling the truth, that they might be purposely misleading people. And he even suggests that maybe they're doing this for their own personal gain, considering how much they've benefited financially from all this.
Okay, so we have these questionable motives. The stories keep changing. People who disagree are silenced. And there's this possible connection to a movement that's all about, like, feeling the spirit rather than following church teachings. It sounds like Davies is making a pretty strong case against Medjugorje. But he wrote this book decades ago. What's happened since then? Like, what does the church officially say about all of this?
So Davies has all these concerns, and he's making some serious accusations. But what does the church actually say about all this? Like, have they made any official statements on Medjugorje?
Well, it's been a developing situation. When Davies wrote his book, the church hadn't really given a definitive answer about whether the apparitions were real or not.
So it's kind of a gray area. People could believe or not believe.
Basically, yeah. But there were some important statements from church authorities that, kind of showed how they were approaching Medjugorje.
Okay, like what? Well, we talked about Bishop Zanic, right? How he was really opposed to the apparitions. He was the local bishop, so his opinion mattered a lot in the church. And then, in 1987, the Yugoslav Bishops' Conference, they came out with a statement that basically banned officially organized pilgrimages to Medjugorje.
So no more, like, busloads of pilgrims going to Medjugorje with the church's blessing.
Exactly. It was their way of saying, we're not endorsing this, at least not yet. But it's important to remember that people could still go on pilgrimages on their own. The church just wasn't going to officially sponsor or organize trips there.
So they're trying to be careful, not wanting to upset the people who felt drawn to Medjugorje, but also not wanting to give something their stamp of approval when they hadn't fully investigated it.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. They were looking for that balance between, respecting people's devotion and being cautious about endorsing something that might not be authentic.
I bet Davies wasn't too happy about that, huh?
No, he wasn't. He thought that church should have been more firm, like come out and clearly condemn the apparitions. He saw the church's hesitation as almost like a failure of leadership, and he worried that it would allow more people to be misled.
Interesting. So we have a local bishop condemning the apparitions, the bishops' conference putting a stop to official pilgrimages, and Michael Davies saying the church needs to be more forceful in denouncing it. What about the Pope? What did he think about Medjugorje?
Well, Pope John Paul II, he never actually made a formal statement about Medjugorje, but there are reports that, privately he expressed doubts about the apparitions. And he also never visited Medjugorje, even though he went to a lot of other Marian shrines during his time as Pope.
So he was kind of making a statement with his actions, even if he didn't say anything officially.
You could say that. It seems like he wasn't convinced based on, his decision not to go there and what people said he said privately.
What about the popes who came after him? Did they have anything to say about Medjugorje?
So Pope Benedict XVI, back when he was still Cardinal Ratzinger, he was in charge of the Vatican office that protects church doctrine. He was known to be really careful about apparitions in general, and even though he didn't say anything publicly about Medjugorje, he did oversee the church's investigation into what was happening.
So the Vatican was keeping an eye on things.
Oh, yeah. And that continued under Pope Francis. In 2017, he appointed a special envoy to go investigate the pastoral situation in Medjugorje. He acknowledged that, a lot of pilgrims were having positive experiences there, like conversions and growing in their faith, but he was still cautious about the apparitions themselves.
So he was saying like, okay, good things are happening, but we're not sure about the apparitions themselves. Did anything come out of that investigation?
Well, in 2019, Pope Francis said that pilgrimages to Medjugorje were okay again. He lifted the ban that was put in place earlier.
So that's a win for the Medjugorje supporters, right? Does that mean the church is finally saying, yes, these apparitions are real?
Not quite. It's important to understand that allowing pilgrimages doesn't mean the church is saying, we believe in the apparitions. They were acknowledging that good things were coming out of Medjugorje. People were coming back to the faith, becoming more devout, but they still haven't made a final decision about the apparitions themselves.
So even though people can go on official pilgrimages now, the apparitions themselves are still being investigated.
That's right. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, they're still studying it all. And the church is open to, maybe making a statement about it in the future, saying whether they think the apparitions are authentic or not.
Okay, so after looking at all of Davies' arguments and seeing how the church's position has, kind of evolved over time, what are faithful Catholics supposed to think about all this?
It's complicated. Davies's book, it really reminds us to be careful to use our judgment even when we encounter something that seems, really spiritual or miraculous. We can't just turn off our brains. We have to think critically, use our reason, and remember what the church teaches.
So it's good to be a little skeptical.
Yeah, definitely. We have to be careful about anything that goes against what the church teaches or that, tries to undermine the magisterium, even if it seems appealing or even miraculous. At the end of the day, our faith should be rooted in Christ and his church, not in private revelations or weird phenomena.
That's a good point. It sounds like we need to find that balance between faith and reason, being open to the supernatural, but also thinking critically.
Exactly. We got to approach these things with humility, realizing that we can be fooled even if we have good intentions. It's so important to pray for guidance, to study the church's teachings, and to talk to wise and knowledgeable people about this stuff.
So, healthy skepticism, a solid understanding of church teaching, a prayerful heart, and a discerning mind. Great advice. Thanks for helping us unpack all this. It's been really interesting.
My pleasure. And remember, our journey of faith, it's a lifelong thing. It's about seeking the truth and getting closer to God.
And sometimes that journey takes us to some pretty challenging and thought-provoking places. For our listeners, we encourage you to keep digging into this. Read Michael Davies' book, look at what other people have to say, and just keep seeking the truth. And as always, thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.